Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So we're going to get started. This is the second lecture of Maneesh. And just a reminder, Maneesh has kindly also offered an additional lecture. So today is going to be more on the cognitive computation. And then there's an additional lecture, which is today.
No, it's tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yep.
Tomorrow as well. So tomorrow, 5 to 6, there's another additional lecture from Maneesh that is optional. You can attend it. And for Beijing, I think it's late, but we will record it so that you guys also can see the additional lecture.
Picture of this. May I just... Okay, so the explanation for this kind of rejig is I thought having, based on some of the questions that had come up during my first lecture and during other lectures and the content of the other lectures, but trying to switch gears and suddenly start talking about representations in neurons and things like that might sort of take us off in a rather different direction. And a lot of these issues might be addressed, although not resolved by any means, by some recent work that I've been doing with some collaborators, who I'll show you in a moment. And so I thought maybe I would change and talk about that instead. This lecture, it'll sort of fit in slightly better. But then for those who are interested in more, sort of thinking more about neural implementations of these sorts of things, I'll try to give at least part of what my original plan was for the second lecture. Okay, so as I said, this is sort of relatively hot off the press work. Maybe the second time I'm giving a talk about it, and we're going to be presenting it sort of more publicly for the first time at the CCN meeting next week in San Francisco. So it's not, I think there's going to be a bunch of unanswered questions at the end, but it's not perhaps sort of wrapped together in quite the way that one might expect at a sort of teaching venue. But maybe that's good. It'll also give you a feeling for kind of what we, at least as part of the field, are wrestling with at the moment in thinking about perception. And I will say that, so the big difference from my original chart was, you might recall that I was sort of stressing inference and the process of putting different sources of information together. In this talk, I won't be talking about that. Instead, I'll be talking about how observers handle uncertainty in single quantities. Okay, and I'll give you some evidence for a conclusion on that score. And then I'll sort of speculate pretty wildly with very little evidence as to what might be going on, or what sorts of, try to assemble the little bits of evidence we have about what might be going on in creating that sort of single signal uncertainty, because I think it's a big puzzle. It's something that we really don't understand in the field. Okay, so I said that this is a collaboration. It's a collaboration with Athena Akrami's lab. She's a physiologist and also, in fact, came from theory at the Sainsbury Wellcome Center, which is a new experimental neuroscience group, system neuroscience group, and we in the Gatsby unit and the SWC share this new building in central London. And the Athena and I co-advise Peter Vincent, a graduate student, and so the work I'm going to show you is really all Peter's. Okay, so this is a slide from one of the experiments I told you about on, what was it, Sunday? And it is here going to basically just make the point that when you do this kind of psychophysical experiment in lab, or in case of these particular experiments online, what the finding that we always have is, that's quite consistent, is a function of whatever the stimulus parameter is. In this case, it was the Vernier offset between these two Gabors. If you look at the answers that individuals will give, you'll get some sort of curve with a non-negligible slope, or a non-infinite slope around 0. Okay, and well, it may not be around 0. There may be a systematic bias, but That's not what we're focusing on. We're focusing on the variability. So there's this region where the same exact physical stimulus on the screen, to the extent that we can control photons coming from the screen, will evoke, if it's over here, 75% of the time, the person will say left, 25% of the time they'll say right. Okay, and this is true for single subjects as well as obviously when you aggregate across subjects. And I think it's this, one of the underlying puzzles that we're coming back to is that we really don't understand why, right? In terms of the ability of the visual system from an ideal observer point of view, right? If I took the activity of retinal ganglion cells and fed them into a computer and tried to get the computer to make this estimate, having kind of done the optimal calculation, the curve would be almost perfect. There's a huge amount of information coming in from the retina. Okay. Now, there's been lots of speculation about where it may come from. One thought is that the idea of zero offset is something that is actually not a native idea. We don't have perfect detectors for zero. We have to learn what zero is. And as we change our belief about zero offset in terms of the pattern, things will change from trial to trial. I'm going to argue that that view probably is inconsistent with the data I will show you today. But there are others, right? Obviously, there's lots of different things the brain needs to do. So the fact that you might be able to be optimal given the input of this particular task may be irrelevant because there are bottlenecks that essentially are inherited from lots of other things that the brain is adapted to do. And there's no particular reason for evolutionary adaptation to have driven the ability to do this particular task to such high precision. That's a little vague, and that's the kind of hand wavy level that unfortunately I think I'm going to end up leaving us at, but we'll try to chip away at the problem and constrain it as best as we can. Okay, but the other thing you'll remember from my talk on Sunday, and I think the other talks, is that although there is this variability, that variability seems to be taken into account by what here we're going to call decision-making processes, or they may be higher level perceptual processes. And Q combination is an excellent example of that, right? So you'll remember that we used these psychophysical curves, just as on the last slide, to estimate the variability or to quantify the variability that people have in their responses given haptic information alone or given visual information alone with different noise levels. And then given that those levels of variability, we said, well, if the observers sort of are able to take that variability into account such that on a single trial, given that they know, in quotes, given that their system is adapted to the fact that they have variability, there should be an associated uncertainty in the information associated with the single trial information that comes with that single trial information. And there's one uncertainty level in the haptic information, a different and variable uncertainty level in the visual information. And we have a prediction for how those two things should get put together at this sort of Gauss combination of Gaussians, add the precisions and use precision-weighted combinations of the means. And indeed, people's responses to the joint information agree with that prediction. Right. So the lesson from here is, the lesson on Sunday was people seem to be able to put together variable sources of information in this broadly optimal way, sort of a sign of effective perceptual inference. And we're thinking about it as making an inference about one quantity, which is the height of the bar, given disparate sources of information about that one quantity. What we didn't dwell on was, well, why are those sources of information unreliable in the first place, right? And but I think the other lesson to draw from this is that whatever the origin of that unreliability, it's presumably, at least in the case of haptic information, something to do with the brain, right? The bar height is the same every time as far as, to within engineering precision of the robot that's setting it. And so that whatever that internal process is that's generating variability, the sort of perceptual processes that follow it are well calibrated to it. They're matched well. And I think this argues against a lot of that, just this observation and more that we'll make, argues against a lot of that variability that we see overall in behavior coming at a late behavioral stage, because we need, the variability is likely to happen early such that it can, in these situations, be combined well. And again, we'll come back to this underlying point through the talk. Not sure what this slide is here. All right. That was just going back to the work I did with Louise Whiteley and saying, here's another example of using knowledge about the variability to, in this case, affect a decision in this asymmetric cost setup, again from Sunday. All right. So we're going to look at a different experiment today. I'm not going to call it a new experiment because it's an experiment that many people have done over the years. And some properties about it have been extremely well studied, and those aren't the ones we're going to focus on today. So it's a method, what psychophysicists call a method of adjustment response task for reasons, well, I'll mention in a moment. People see two sample-oriented gratings on a screen at the beginning of the trial. They're up for half a second, they then disappear. And then there's this period over which they need to remember, initially both of them, then they're given a cue which tells them which of those two they're going to need to respond to. So they can now focus their memory or attention or whatever you want to call it on just that one. They need to wait another couple of seconds, and now a new grating appears, and they have to rotate that grating by pressing two keys on the keyboard until it matches their memory of whichever grating was cued. That's the task. They do that. They press space to say they're happy with their rotation. They don't get any feedback trial to trial. They just go back to the next stimulus and keep going. Okay, so very simple task. And one advantage to maybe the method of adjustment is that although obviously there's some process of adjustment and deciding, what's good enough to accept in this particular trial, which again, we're not really going to model. It's attempting to ask a more direct, perhaps perceptual question, right? So these costs associated with binary decisions, as in this experiment, don't really play a direct role, right? We're basically asking you, what did you see? And because there's a delay involved, that what did you see is both a question about the instantaneous percept you might have had when this came up and your ability to recall it. Yeah.
Two questions. Why do you need the DC before the cue?
So you don't really, and we'll get rid of it. So the reason, well, actually, no. The reason that we have two of them, so we do actually need this delay. The delay we'll get rid of is this one. The reason we have two of them is just that it increases variability. And this is a well-known fact. So if I have to remember more things, I'm more variable in my response to any one of them later on. Something that psychologists have studied for a long time. And so all the results I'll show you do work if you just have one grating to remember and no cue. They just are a lot tighter. And some of the things that I want to separate, which are going to be means, modes, and medians of the same distribution, just become much closer together and harder to separate. And so we wanted to introduce more variability.
Okay. And my other question is, how do you reward them? Like, what is their objective?
To get through some number of trials and get paid for having done so. So we're relying on their willingness to actually do the task well.
They have no incentive.
They have no particular incentive to do this. I think that's somewhat important, because if we'd given them a cost function for accuracy, we'd be opposing a particular ideal response strategy. And in some sense here, we're looking at their native response strategy.
Okay, but it also means that you cannot write an ideal model that you would we could use as a benchmark to compare the behavior to, right?
That's true. So we're just going to go in and interrogate their behavior in a model-free way, if you like.
Yes, I mean, so, sorry, this is sort of half-baked.
Yeah.
Related to that, I mean, it seems like you're trying to use this different paradigm to address the same question of like, what are people seeing? What is their perception? But there are different tasks, right? And like, I see that because you're not imposing a reward function, you're not.
Yes, so part of it is to try to access this sort of native sense of, if I just ask you to tell me what you saw, what do you do? Part of it is method of adjustment, as you'll see, gives us much finer grained information about what's going on inside the perceptual system, which will be crucial to the arguments we're going to make. We have actually done the same thing without the memory phase. Again, if you just put up the two gratings together, the variability is minuscule. And so we can't really access a lot of what's going on. If you try to create variability in other ways, and so what we did was to use a scatter of Gabor patches, and you had to match the average orientation of that scatter of Gabor patches, the noise properties start to change. And this is another one of the lessons we've learned from this, is that for a long time, we've sort of assumed that variability that comes from different sources is all the same. It can be, averaging a cloud of dots to find the mean. It can be a low contrast stimulus. It can be, distraction or other things. And these all lead to the same variability. And one of the things this tells us is that's not true. They actually have quite different distributional structures internally when you create variability in different ways. That's not something I'm going to talk about here, but it just comes back to your question of why are we using this paradigm?
Yeah, I mean, okay.
Yep.
But I'm still, I want to carry on, continue Hoke's question because so I'm familiar with those kind of scatters to study the oblique effect, for example, stuff like this. So here I don't understand the logic. So you're saying we're going to measure to see that noise depends on the conditions. And presumably that has to do with the fact that the subject wants to do different things in different conditions. So for example, here we'll try to remember both of them. But then you say we don't want to involve what the subject wants. We don't want to think about objective. So you see.
Well, let's go through, because I'm not convinced that these issues are going to be pertinent to the conclusions I try to draw from this. But maybe we should just hold on to them and come back at the end if they're still disturbing at the end. Any other questions at this point? Yep.
Is there interaction between the two patterns? Like if you rotate the second one, will that affect your...
So as far as we can tell, so a couple of things. So these experiments are done online. Anyone who's done online experiments knows that data are questionable, right? This is sending it out to large groups. So we do have a little bit of just checking to make sure that people are actually paying attention to what we've asked them to do. One of those is that we look for correlation with the of their responses with the irrelevant state. And most people actually have very little. And so there are a couple who have substantial who get excluded. There are also the ones who have no correlation with the cued stimulus, of course, get excluded. Okay. All right, so let's think about this process, right? And so I'm going to take a little while to flesh out something I think you've actually heard about before in one of the other talks, sort of what I'm going to call the standard psychophysical model for thinking about these sorts of things. And this is both, it's used in signal detection theory, it's used in thinking about method of adjustment, it's used in thinking about coding of stimuli, and it's pretty much the standard picture we have for modeling an experiment like this. There's a stimulus, that's a property of the physical world. There's a response, that's I guess a property of the observer, right? But we measure it in the physical world, so there's no ambiguity about those two things directly. But there's an internal representation. And the idea is that if I present a stimulus, that gets mapped by some sort of sensory process, and in our case, sensory and memory process. We're going to put those two things together, at least initially, into some sort of value of internal representation. And I've drawn this kind of as a single axis and put a point on it, so you can kind of imagine a 1D internal representation for orientation. And we're going to come back to that point later on. But again, in most psychophysics, that is the standard picture. If I have a one-dimensional property, I'm varying the stimulus, and a one-dimensional property that the response depends on, I tend to boil down the internal representation to one number. Obviously, if we think about brains, there's not going to be one number I can find somewhere in the brain that is that. But so one way that you might want to think about this, is everyone familiar with the term sufficient statistic? Anyone has not heard the term sufficient statistic? No? Yeah. Okay. So it's a statistical idea, as the term might give away. It is a situation where you have a random quantity, a multidimensional random quantity, often a big sample. And there are some parameters that dictate the distribution of that quantity. And there is some statistic that is a function of the measurements, such that if you know the statistic, in effect, you know everything that links the parameter to the data set. So for example, if I generate data from a Gaussian distribution with unknown mean and unknown variance, but there is a mean and a variance out there, those are the parameters, then I can generate thousands of data points. But if you calculate the sample mean and the sample variance of those data, that's the only information that links the whole data set to the parameters. Okay, and so those are the sufficient statistics associated with a Gaussian distribution. That idea, sufficient statistic, will become crucial when we talk about stuff on, I guess, tomorrow. It's fundamental to maths tomorrow. Today, I just bring it up because I think one of the ways to think about this internal representation is as the sufficient statistics linking the orientation here, which is like a parameter of whatever the internal distribution is, to the neuronal activity that represents it. So this idea that I have a one-dimensional axis of measurement in the brain is tantamount to saying there is a one-dimensional sufficient statistic. Okay, so that's probably a better way to think about it than that there be one number somewhere in the brain. Okay, and so now the observer takes that internal representation, has this dial. It's a much more complicated process involving having the internal representation of the match stimulus and matching them somehow internally, which we're going to ignore. We're just going to say you're going to take that internal representation and produce a response from it. Okay. So again, this, whether in our case the response is a continuous orientation in a standard psychophysical task, that might be a two alternative forced choice. But this idea that you map stimulus to some internal representation, that the same stimulus might generate different values of the internal representation. So there's a noisy process there, which draws some sort of distribution like this. That idea is really the sort of by far the most standard modeling tool for these kinds of tasks, right? It's so standard that we sort of assume it, we take it for granted without really looking at it and criticizing it. Okay, but that's the idea, right? So this is the input. There's some trial to trial. I'll get a distribution of internal representations, one for each trial, and therefore I'll get a distribution of responses. And for most of the lecture, I'm going to assume that the second step, the response strategy, is noise-free. Think of that as, for now, as an ansatz. It's an assumption that we'll take as a working assumption and work with, and we'll find that it gives us consistent results. The results are still tolerant to small amounts of response noise, but I think they seem to argue, or it will be hard to get the same results with large response noise, and we'll come back to that later. Okay, so now, if we take a single experiment, a single trial of the experiment, we presented a stimulus and we measured a response. And the question we might have is, well, what can we say about the process that the observer might be using to come up with that particular response? Okay, and so if this mapping from internal representation to response is noise-free, and broadly speaking, if it's one-to-one, then I can invert it, right? So I have for that response came from some value of the internal representation or some value of the sufficient statistic. But that value of the sufficient statistic could have arisen from a whole range of different stimuli. because of the forward noise and the mapping from stimulus to response, right? And this thing here is the likelihood function that I think you've heard about time and time again. Yeah.
It's a technicality, but it could be noise-free and not be bijective.
It could be noise-free and not be bijective. And indeed, if the internal representation was multidimensional, it would have to be,
Exactly.
right?
So you're assuming it's bijective.
I'm assuming that if it's one-dimensional, it's bijective, which seems like a pretty reasonable assumption, right? If I shift the internal representation a little bit clockwise, if my response didn't move or moved anti-clockwise, that would be weird, right? Okay. Okay, and so now, right, what we can do, as you'll see, is we can actually look at this likelihood function directly using method of adjustment. That's why method of adjustment is so powerful. So I'll show you why on the next slide. But having been able to look at it, we can now ask a very simple question, right? If given the internal representation and sort of perfect knowledge of the mapping process from which that internal representation arose, an ideal observer sitting up here could choose to respond with various different statistics of this underlying likelihood. And three possibilities, or four actually, three possibilities that are deterministic would be the mode of that distribution, the median, the mean, right? And in particular, this paradigm will give us a skewed distribution here, as you'll see, such that these things can be distinguished. So we can ask which one people respond with, if any. We can also break our assumption of deterministic response here. Another candidate response strategy that people have discussed extensively in the literature is that given the internal representation, you have this uncertainty about what the stimulus is, and you draw a sample from that distribution and respond with that sample. Okay, that's not optimal by most definitions, except perhaps if you want to do some sort of exploration. But it is a candidate response that strategy that people have looked at, and there are some data at more cognitive levels that seem more consistent with a sampling response strategy than a deterministic one.
If we're assuming, I guess, a bijection between the internal representation and the response, can we not further say that, like, if this bijection is continuous, the internal representation is basically just a copy of that interval, or like the flipped version?
Yeah, so we will use that idea in a slightly different way later on. But yes, the internal representation has units that, as it says, we have no idea what they are. And so indeed, we get to we can think about stretching and moving things around. The distributions I will reference are going to be in stimulus space, and they'll be measured in angles.
So then I guess in general, is it fair to assume that in the brain, like, I guess representations are consistent with what, I guess, the actual intervals that you see in the real world?
So I actually think there's evidence that they're not. I think so this is sort of some more speculative stuff that we might talk about at the end, but one of the other phenomena that this experimental design has been used to study is the fact that responses, let me just say, we can also worry about whether there's some sort of internal prior that gets combined with the likelihood to shape any of the responses I talked about. So as I drew it, it was the mean, mode, and median of the likelihood function. I could multiply that by a prior and take the mean, median, or mode of the posterior distribution. And indeed, when I sample, I could sample either from something that has a flat associated prior, essentially discounting any other prior I may have, or I have a shaped prior.
So here, without assuming a prior, you're still taking an asymmetric likelihood function?
Yep, and that's because that's what people do. Okay, so this is a histogram of orientation samples provided and responses that correspond to that, collapsed over many observers. And everything, again, I'll show you is going to be averaged over many observers. We've gone back and done it observer by observer, and all the phenomena hold up. Okay, and you can see it's a rather distinctive pattern. Right? So there's a faint line over here, that's the diagonal. And what you can see is that near 0, which is vertical, and pi over 2, which is horizontal by our convention, they emphasize small deviations away in memory. So if I was slightly, whatever, pi over 12 or something like that, I might get a response that on average is pi over 6. I think the dashed line here is the average response as a function of the stimulus. You can also see that the variance varies, right? So there's a lot more variance over here than there is, say, at vertical. These phenomena are very well known. This anti-cardinal bias, the fact that your responses are repelled away from the cardinal directions, vertical and horizontal, has been studied very extensively. People think they understand it well. I'll come back to that question. Okay, but that's not really the main focus of what we're going to look at today. It's just a convenient fact because it makes all of our likelihoods. Yes.
I imagine this is controlled for, but when the subject is allowed to respond, is there a random initial grading angle they're starting from?
Yep.
So that 0 is not because they just started 0.
Initial grading comes up at a random angle. Okay, so now the point is, as I said, that if I now take all trials on which the subjects responded with an angle of pi/6, and I look at all the samples that evoked that, by the reasoning of the previous slide, that slice, right, which is some distribution, is the likelihood function. Actually, well, it's the likelihood function because in this particular experiment, we've used a uniform sample distribution. It is the likelihood function associated with the internal variable that maps to that response. Okay? And so given that fact, it's very easy to work out what its mode, median, and mean are, and look at the difference between the response and those three statistics. That's kind of the first step of what we're going to do. Yeah.
Even though you have used a unique, but there's still a prior that comes.
They may have a different prior. And so we will come back to that question later on. The first point, though, is that when you do this, the answer is pretty clear, right? So these are the modes. It's a little hard to get modes from empirical distribution. So there's some smoothing that has to be done. Things depend a little bit on the smoothing, and that's why it's so noisy. We do this many times with many different parameters, and that's the range of values that you see. And you can see that they are systematically perturbed away from 0. So is the median. It's a subtler thing. It's kind of this purple line. But again, it's showing this kind of bumpy shape, and frequently these bootstrapped confidence intervals leave 0 systematically. Not true for the means. People seem to be responding very reliably with the means. There is a little bit of residual shape in the means. If you do do test for non-zero Fourier components, you can find significant non-zero Fourier components in that shape. They are there. But if you do the naive thing, in fact, if you just do a statistical test point by point, then when multi-test corrected, there's no significant difference from 0. So you have to go in with a specific hypothesis about shape of deviation to find that shape of deviation. I wouldn't say they respond precisely with the mean every time, but the mean's a pretty good model. Okay, so this is conclusion 1, right? Responses are very well calibrated to the means of the associated likelihood functions, which slightly argues against a strong prior playing the role as well. So a lot of this is we set up one hypothesis and find consistency with it. We've done a bunch of work to try to see whether there are other hypotheses that are or aren't consistent, and I'll talk a little bit about those, although I'm not sure I have many of the slides. But really, it's quite hard to get this sort of precise agreement from other schemes.
Maneesh,
yeah,
probably you will say this later, but or comment on it later. But presumably, one can manipulate this by changing the reward, the incentive. So is it wrong to think that this is because they have internally
squared error?
Squared error.
It maybe not, right? I mean, we are sort of interrogating what we're thinking of as the natural error metric. Why that would be squared error, I have no idea. That's a bizarre battle. Anything that has
the minimum which is not singular
and is it has to be convex, and I think have certain interesting properties, right, to be close enough. Yeah, I mean, but yes, that's fine. right? But the idea is that in terms of, again, the instructions, if you like, are respond with what you saw, right? Just match to what you saw. So as in our ability to ask questions about what it means to say, what did I see? Seems like the closest way to achieve that experimental tool. So indeed, if people intrinsically interpret what did I saw as get as close as possible in some loss function that is convex with the right shape, that's fine.
I guess, wouldn't a more surprising result be if you gave them an incentive, try to pull them away from the mean of the posterior, and you still found the mean? And then it would mean that intrinsically they're
Yeah, I mean, so we actually have given them a 0-1 loss with an interval of which they're correct, but the right response strategy should be different. But we didn't show them the interval trial by trial, right? We just said, we just gave them right or wrong, and the underlying cost was that. They still responded this way.
say.
But again, they would have had to learn that that was the cost function, but it was a binary response, so it had to be something like that, right?
In the experiment, was there a training phase in which they were trained with this uniform prior? Without that phase.
So we've done it. I think I think I took it out. We did try to change the prior. The reason we got into this in the first place wasn't any of this stuff. It was because we had done earlier work on memory with priors, and we wanted to investigate that more extensively. In this particular experiment, any effect of the prior is extremely subtle, of the in-experiment prior. Right. We'll talk a little bit about any prior they may bring to the task, but the in-experiment prior over the kinds of durations that we've looked at here, and given the systematic biases that arise from somewhere else, right? These systematic biases here, it looks as though, it's very hard to get a strong impact of the prior. There may be a very subtle one.
Did you try to fit the loss functions? Just so that they could take error and raise it to an exponent?
Yeah, no, I think no, we didn't actually. That's a good. I mean, it would have to. I'd have to think about exactly how we would need to do that, but it would be interesting to think about. No, we didn't.
Because I know for motor control.
Mm-hmm.
There's one paper that shows that like a pea shooter experiment, you were like shooting
mm-hmm.
and you shoot a target and your cursor was noisy.
Mm-hmm.
And they tried to look at where people would end up aiming, and it was the noise was skewed. But
mm-hmm.
anyway, they fit rather than quadratic, it was close to quadratic, 1.7, which was suggested that it would go bust to outliers.
Okay. Yeah, no, it would be interesting to try to do that. We haven't. Okay. The other thing I think it argues is that this idea that we're sensitive to distributions, which, with a few exceptions, has largely been investigated just sort of single parameters of uncertainty, variance in effect, extends to things that are more complex distributions. In this case, these skewed distributions, right? So the responses that people are giving mapped from that internal variable, that mapping is sensitive to the fact that there are these skewed underlying likelihood functions. And again, I think this argues sort of post hoc by the fact that this seems to work without assuming additional output noise, but that output noise is at least small. And a rather strange effect, just to point out, is if we were doing this in linear coordinates, then actually any amount of output noise would be fine because it doesn't change means. On a circle, adding zero mean noise changes a mean. It's a nasty fact of circular statistics. And so in fact, in order for this to hold up, one would need to have relatively small amounts of output noise. And my personal suspicion is that the small residual variability is coming from some response noise. But I don't have a proof of that. Okay. And again, this argues, again, sort of rather post hoc hand-wavy way, there seems to be little evidence for some strong internal prior that's biasing these results. And again, in the experiment I've shown you, the samples were uniformly distributed. So that means either that people overrode an intrinsic prior based on this, but then later experiments where we varied that that experimental prior argues against that too.
So the likelihood itself, that is constrained by the prior, like that shows.
So that's a very interesting point, right? So the leading hypothesis for this Q, I would say, and there's been various ideas, but one of the hypotheses for this is that it comes from the consequences of an internal code that is adapted in a way that was proposed by Ganguly and Simoncelli to a background prior. Okay, so we'll come back to that at the very, very end. Okay, so these were deterministic models, right? We can also actually, it turns out, interrogate the sampling idea. And now we're going to allow for some internal prior because that's going to play a large role in any distribution for sampling. So what if the response is drawn from some internal belief that I've called Q over the stimulus angle given the internal variable? Okay, so a little bit of maths. What we're looking at is a joint distribution over responses and stimuli, right? We can always decompose that as whatever the experimental distribution was over stimuli. Times the distribution of responses given stimuli. And that distribution depends on internal variable, right? So there's a process within the brain that takes the stimulus and maps it to internal variable. I'm allowing now, because it doesn't matter for the internal variable to be a vector rather than a scalar. That's why the bold X doesn't really matter to the maths. And now the sampling idea is that there's an internal belief Q about the stimulus value, which is based on X, conditioned on X, and the response probability, the probability with which you respond R is the mass assigned to R, or the density assigned to R in that distribution, right? And now I have to integrate over all the different internal variables X that I might have generated. So that's just a little bit of breaking up probabilities over here. This Q of S given R, of S being equal to R given X, I can break down by Bayes' rule, and I'm going to assume that the observer has the correct forward distribution, that is, knows the probability distribution over the internal variable that would be obtained in order for the sampling to be consistent, given that the external stimulus had the value R. But then they have their own prior belief over that probability, right? So Q here may not be the experimental prior, and therefore there may be a marginal, the normalizing Bayes rule, which is a probability of getting the internal variable X when integrated over all possible stimuli. That again could be whatever is dictated by the internal variable. Doesn't matter. The internal prior. Okay, what's important here is that this prior comes out of the integral. And so what we're left with is a piece inside here, which if you look at it, ends up being symmetric in S and R, right? It has this X term here, which doesn't matter. And I have the same function of X given R in this case and given S in this case. So I've got a symmetric interior piece, a uniform, because this is the experimental prior, remember, it's what we see in the experimental data. So I have a uniform by design piece over here. And then I have some unknown internal prior over here. So what I can do is I can say, take the matrix that is the histogram of this distribution and try to decompose it into a symmetric piece and what turns out to be a diagonal piece because it's only a function of R. Okay. And then when I do that, I will learn what internal prior people might have, and I will get access to that symmetric piece. And so that's what we can do. This is the optimal prior that you learn as a result, which is a anti-cardinal prior. So it gives more mass to slanted angles, plus and minus 45 degrees. That's opposite to the priors, the sort of natural priors that people have measured when they go out and measure what sort of natural directional statistics, and also opposite to the priors that people assume when they build the efficient coding models. Nonetheless, it's what comes out of this. But then when we look at the symmetric part and we ask, is it in fact symmetric? So we take this P, divide out the learned Q, that gives us Q inverse P, and just look at the anti-symmetric part of that, it has very substantial deviations away from the origin, which are significant. Okay, so basically this is to say we can't do it, right? So there isn't a combination of a symmetric matrix and a diagonal one that gives rise to the data that we see. So it doesn't look like people are using a consistent sampling strategy as their response. Okay, so interim conclusions. So we're sort of doing questions as we go. So I can spill to the hour and a half. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we can.
Yeah. So do keep asking questions. There's actually not that much more that I have here, so I think we won't have trouble with time. Okay, so our interim conclusions.
Right. So
Okay.
42.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was an hour, but then there's a half hour of discussion. So we're kind of discussing as we go, which is much better. Okay, so those response strategy is sensitive to this distribution of whatever this variability is, this internal noise. It seems to the response strategy closely follows the mean of the likelihood. Appears to involve quite little or perhaps no stochasticity given the internal representation. Again, my guess is there's a small amount that accounts for the slight deviation. Okay, so some questions. So as I said, in the standard psychophysical model, effectively we're thinking about this one-dimensional internal variable, right? Or one-dimensional sufficient statistic of whatever the internal representation might be. And also, again, and this is the standard model theory and other psychophysics as well as what we've looked at here, there's a deterministic decision process given that internal variable. And so this sort of response strategy must know, right? So in order to get a good deterministic decision rule, somehow whatever's doing that has to be adapted to this internal distribution process. So how tenable is this kind of one-dimensional picture given the evidence that we're looking at over here? Yeah.
Before you go to that, so have you tried the same experiment with different priors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mean different experimental priors? Yeah, yeah. So we've again, the original point of this whole diversion to this experiment was that, and so yes, we did that early on with just a von Mises concentrated prior at one particular location, and we see essentially no effects in the course of this experiment.
The mean of the superior.
No, mean of the likelihood. They don't seem to take into account. So we have to divide out. See if I've got the figure. We have to divide out the experimental prior to get the likelihood, and it's the mean of the likelihood. It's not the mean of the posterior. So in this particular case, it might be that they're not doing enough trials to have learnt that prior effectively. It might. So I have another hypothesis, which is that when we see effects of priors in experiment priors very strongly, like in contraction bias effects that Jonathan has studied extensively and that we've looked at with different distributions recently, the parameter that we're asking people to respond to usually has no sort of absolute reference frames. So, for example, our work was done with frequency, and most people have no sense of absolute frequency at all. And I think some of Jonathan's experiments were done length of a bar on the screen or something like that. The orientation has these really strong reference points, vertical and horizontal. And I think that may change people's acquisition. So I think part of learning a prior may be something about learning a good way to think about internal measurement parameter, because we aren't often asked to make direct judgments about the frequency of a pure tone or about the length of a bar in this way. And so I think we end up having to learn that and therefore learn the experimental prior. I think angle probably, there's just a more natural reference frame and we're more used to dealing with it. That's a guess, right? But
then that's surprising that they don't have those exact priors in the experiment.
They don't use the cardinal prior in their response process. Yeah.
I have a question about the sampling model.
About, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did you consider also models that take a subset, some samples and average?
So of course, in the limit, that's the mean, right? And so
If it's a small subset, you cannot.
so basically, that's a process that will take the mean and some variability around that mean, and the shape of that variability will be dictated. So yes, I'm sure whether we can get a closer match than just the mean by that process. I don't know. We didn't try it. It's kind of it's one of the free parameters one could play with. It's true.
There's a question in the chat about the key between your weight and stuff.
Okay. Yep. So maybe we'll come back to that. I've got a figure that shows that basically the Weyenstocker idea has been used by Paul Bayes and his collaborators very extensively to model exactly this experiment. It gets the bias right, okay? And that's what they've always focused on. It doesn't get the pattern of responses. I'll show you. I've got a supplementary figure at the end where we can. But in terms of what the difference is, again, we're not making any statements. We're not trying to build up a normative model for what the internal representation should look like. We're just trying to interrogate what information we can get about it from the experiment, and ask what the response strategy is given that internal representation. Okay. So is this tunable? So another thing that you can do with this full histogram and the method of adjustment is sort of comes back to a point that somebody brought up before, which is that we can sort of think about we've got this one-dimensional axis, and we're sort of taking the stimulus, distorting it into the internal representation in some way, and distorting that into the response. And we can actually try to kind of anchor those distortions in some sense. And so again, the logic is as follows. Again, we're going to assume the mapping from X to R, which I'm now going to call rho. And really, I guess I do mean a scalar X here, so I should have gotten rid of the bold X, a one-dimensional scalar X. Assume that is one-to-one, which broadly means it's monotonic, since it's a one-dimensional to one-dimensional thing. And what we mean by monotonic on the circle is that the first derivative it always has the same sign locally. Okay, so then if I take a distribution on X given S, right, that's that noise distribution. If I have a monotonic mapping, then the medians map according to that same monotonic mapping, right? If I've got a monotonic mapping, I take a point such that half the mass lies on each side, and I go through the mapping, then that central point mapped through the mapping also has half the mass on each side. Right? Now, of course, as we've discussed, the internal variable has some units and scales that we don't necessarily know, so we get to sort of choose that for our purposes. And so we're going to assume that it is such that the median of the distribution, P of X given S, is just S. So we're going to anchor our internal variable scale such that half the time the noise puts you clockwise of the internal variable, half of the stimulus, half the time it puts you anti-clockwise. Yeah, as reasonable a choice as any. Okay, so now we can take our histogram, right, and calculate, instead of the means, the median of the distribution with sort of appropriate smoothing, and get this function here. And by this logic, we've assumed that the median of X given S is S, and we've also assumed that the median of rho given S, median of R given S is a rho of that value. That becomes S. And so this function is mapping rho. Assumption what this is that takes them into variable response. And then we can invert it. Right? And so now I can redraw the histogram. Instead of being sample to response, it's now sample to internal variable. Right? Where again, this is internal variable, assuming it's one-dimensional, and assuming that there's this deterministic monotonic mapping to responses. And that the median, it's redrawn so that the median of the internal variable lies on the stimulus, or the axis here is chosen that way. Okay, so you can see that even in the internal variable space, there's this non-homogeneous noise. Okay, so you've got higher variance over here. The bias has kind of gone away by definition, right? We define this such that the median at least sits there. The mean might be slightly off. But there's also an interesting feature that is going to be highlighted by this little box over here, which will blow up on the next slide. But you can sort of see it here, which is that there's this local asymmetry. There's a lot more mass down here than there is up on that side. And if we do blow that up, what it looks like is that there's sort of this, I don't know if you want to call it a line, it's not really a line, it's slightly sloped, but there seems to be what I'm going to think of as a sort of barrier to answering with a cardinal angle when the original angle was relatively oblique, right? So if the original angle was the red, you get a long tail over here, but you seem very unlikely to respond with vertical. On the other hand, if the original angle was a little bit closer to vertical, then you're perfectly happy to respond with vertical as well. Right? That's the cyan one over here. Right? So there seems to be a transition from angles that you're willing to accept were vertical to angles that you insist are not. Right? And so I think this is a hint that something richer than one dimension is going on. Maybe it's special to angles and has something to do with cardinal categorization. Maybe it doesn't. We can come back to that. But I think it's an interesting way to think about things. So one of the other dominant models for thinking about working memory variability is essentially that you have some sort of line attractor or one-dimensional attractor, and then you have some diffusion along that attractor. So you lock into one point on the circle, but now through memory, there's some diffusion. And if you think about this as a diffusive process, which is what these little dots are supposed to reflect, then your diffusion process has to be constrained by some sort of reflecting barrier sitting kind of close to the cardinal axes, right? So you're allowed to diffuse out away from there, right? The purple one is able to give mass out away from vertical. Sorry, the cyan one is able to give mass away from vertical. But the ones that start away from vertical seem to be blocked. Yes.
I have a question about the experiment itself.
Yep.
When you plot a line on a computer screen,
yep.
It's rather easy to say whether it's exactly vertical or exactly horizontal compared to not exactly vertical.
Everything's smoothed. I think it's interesting. So first of all, this isn't about exactly, right? It's about close, right? Everything on the screen is smooth. There's no lines. Right, it's all gray shaded filters with reasonably low spatial frequencies compared to the screen resolutions. So I don't think so.
So you think that if you would rotate the screen, it will not have an effect on it?
I think so. We haven't done it, right? I mean, I guess the other. So you're thinking about reference to the frame, or you're thinking about pixelization?
One reference to the frame, but I was thinking about the fact that
pixelizations. Yeah. So reference to the frame is interesting. The other thing, and might be, I think, maybe more of an effect potentially. I think that goes to this idea that angles have some sort of absolute reference frame. We are starting. I mean, this was done over the pandemic, which is why it was all online. We are going to have some in-lab people, which will be done in the dark, so they won't see the frame. So we'll see.
I think I missed the connection with the fact that this suggests a higher dimensional representation for the following reason, that in a one-dimensional representation, there's a redundancy between how you constrain the internal representation and what you assume about the noise. So I could equally say that the internal representation is linear, for example, and then the noise can be as complicated as I want, right?
So what this argues against is a one-dimensional diffusive noise process. Okay. That is a Markov chain of noise.
But why should I assume that?
Because it's a common model. So we're going to come back to the more general question in a moment. But this argument is really that if it were diffusion, right? If I sit at this point, I'm allowed to move this way if I had the if my initial value was the cyan value, but I'm not if my initial value is red. And so I have to have some extra information in order to account for it.
This diffusion model, it's not related to in any way reaction times and.
No, it's not the drift diffusion model. This is diffusion along, it's diffusion causing noise along a ring attractor in this case. But again, it's one of, it's you know, one of the two dominant models for where this variability comes from.
You're assuming symmetric noise, essentially. And that cannot be fitted, of course.
But the process needs to be, has different noise properties depending on what the original stimulus S was. It stops it from being Markov. If there's a diffusion process.
But there, I don't see a essential reason to rule this out.
To rule out.
That the noise should depend on the stimulus.
Because it's not Markov, right? So the idea is that a memory process, my future state has to depend on my current memory state. It can't look back and have extra information about what the stimulus was.
But perceptually, you could have different noises to begin with.
Yeah, but the initial noise won't, unless all of the noise was perceptual and there's no memory noise, which is possible, but ruled out by the next experiment, which is now varying the delay. And we'll see that the noise grows and grows in a consistent way. Okay, so you're right. At the moment, all of the noise could have happened instantaneously. There could have been no memory noise, and then we'd have been okay.
But what if you have some asymmetric perceptual noise and then you have a diffusive memory noise?
Well, let's do this one because it'll. I think this one will rule it out, right? So now we're going to do variable delays. We're going to get rid of the Q dot. Instead, the response stimulus will come up on one side or the other, and that'll be your cue to which one you have to respond to. Okay, so now we can do everything from 0 up to 8 seconds. Okay, so these are the response patterns that we get. This is the short intervals. These are the long intervals. We've sort of left a gap to distinguish things better. You can see that there is indeed higher variance, as you might have expected, when you've got longer to remember things. So the first thing to note is that your mean response strategy is preserved in both cases, even though the likelihoods have changed. Okay, I mean, the XR mapping has to have changed under these two conditions. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second is that if we now take these boxes of the internal variable, this is the S histogram that created that asymmetry. Okay, so I think I'm basically done with kind of core figures. I'll come back because it's come up a lot to an extra slide on thinking about these other higher dimensional variables. But I think to this point is the one that I think is arguing against just the naive one-dimensional representation. It is there needs to be some additional information that's keeping track beyond this internal diffusive variable about what the stimulus was. One possibility is that there's a continuous variable like that and some categorical information, and those two get combined, and the categorical information affects the way the diffusion happens. Right, and that's one way to build a model like this. A very phenomenological kind of cognitive picture, wouldn't be related to neurons in any concrete way, but it's a possible view.
And suppose I have the two-dimensional representation like a torus, and I have a bump diffusing on the torus.
Yep.
And then I have a specific projection from the torus that would give me the one-dimensional variable. Would that? So
we're going to look at a differentiation which comes from the Weyenstocker and Ganguly and Simoncelli work. Torus. So in the rotation cat, we will have an angular variable and variance. It's a procedure. That's what. And it comes close, but it doesn't make it. Okay, so I think you might need to do something richer. So now, so this is what we said before. Observer's response strategy is sensitive to this distribution, seems to follow the mean very closely. would appear to involve relatively little stochasticity, the internal representation has to be able to support this distributional sensitivity and response, even as the distribution changes over time in this case. Okay, so either the response strategy has to have additional out-of-band information about how long it has been since the stimulus was presented, or the representation itself has to somehow carry that information or implicitly carry the information by representing uncertainty moment by moment. So I think this at least argues against a single sufficient statistic, right? You need something like time or and that may be something finer like this categorical information. I'll come back to that question of distribution encoding later. Okay, so things that we haven't answered is we still don't know why we have this noise. It's there. We're characterizing your ability to handle it, but we don't know where it comes from. But we have some clues as to where, some theories about where it comes from, such as sort of diffusion on the line attractor, which at least in their simplest form of a one-dimensional diffusion are probably not consistent. And of course, there's the question about neural substrates of this internal representation. Again, we'll dwell on that a tiny bit later, but I'll say a little bit now because that's where the Weyenstocker and Guni and Simcelli. Let me just, again, before we go on to the extra slides, re-emphasize the fact that it's a collaboration, and what you've seen is basically Peter's PhD thesis. And a couple of, I guess you saw a bit of work from Louise earlier, and Kira, who's a newer graduate student in the group, is also sort of picking up some of this and thinking about how these things might be affected in various forms of neurological disease. Okay, this is the one I want. Yes, this is the one I want. Okay, so I don't have the schematic. Yeah. Okay, I don't have the schematic of Weyenstocker, so I'm going to try to describe what's going on. An old idea in a lot of sensory neuroscience has been that internal representations of quantities. Now, when we do this work, we're usually thinking about internal representations of quantities that we can refer to the outside world, but that's true for here, like angles, right? So these aren't inferences, states that might be some abstract internal inference. These are things that we can anchor in the world, but orientation is one of them. So the idea is that such quantities are encoded efficiently relative to the distribution of values that the animal is likely to encounter in the world. Okay, and so a classic example of this was work by Simon Laughlin, looking at contrast encoding in the retina of the fly. He went out and measured the distribution of contrasts around various rivers and forests in near Cambridge, and then basically worked out that distribution, looked at the response properties of the large monopolar cell in the fly, and showed that basically what the response distribution was doing was a kind of histogram equalization. So it was transforming that input distribution such that it was using its range of possible values from 0 to some kind of maximum release rate. These are not spiking neurons, they're concatenated release neurons. So it's a continuous number from 0 to the maximum release rate uniformly, right? And so that's an efficient way to encode that contrast information. So in the work that, sort of similar work that Ganguly and Simoncelli did, they thought about a population code of spiking neurons as the sort of representation. And they assumed, they modeled each one of these as a signal plus Poisson noise, and that the noise was Poisson distributed and independent, neuron to neuron. And then worked out for a one-dimensional signal what the appropriate distribution of essentially tuning curves, that is functions of firing rate as a function of stimulus value, should be for that population of neurons. to be efficient in the sense of transmitting the most information possible, given the noise properties that they had assumed, and given the distribution of stimuli that the animal might encounter in the world. And the answer is a different kind of something like, a little bit like histogram normalization. And it has a very intuitive picture, which is that if you take the stimulus distribution, can I draw? Yeah. I drag this over to the other side.
Maybe we bring it.
Okay, so let's say that this is the stimulus axis. Let's somewhat leadingly say that this is this is my prior distribution, minus pi over 2, pi over 2, 0. Okay. So let's say that this was the prior. Okay, this is not the experimental prior. This is kind of the background prior of orientations that people might, or animals might encounter in the world at large. And people have actually measured this as part of another set of experiments that Eero Simicelli was involved in. And it actually looks like, it's cardinal biased. Then one way to think about this is to go to an internal representation space, which we can call it U. Okay. And essentially choose a space in which E over U, so there's some mapping, U, which is the deterministic function of S, just F for the function, some deterministic mapping from S to U. We choose the mapping that makes P of U uniform. Right, and most of you will probably know that I can do, at least I'm not on a circle where it's a little bit more complicated, but on a linear axis, I just take the cumulative distribution function of my prior and map through its input to get the uniform. Or map through it to get the uniform, sorry. Okay, now in this space, you place your tuning curves uniformly centered and symmetric. Mine are not. Okay. So basically, given that there's no, now in this space, there's no prior, the best thing to do is basically take whatever your resources are and tile the space evenly with your resources. That's a reasonably intuitive picture. And of course, this implies that if we look now back in S space, we'll get a distribution of tuning curves as a function of S, which will no longer be uniform, right? They will be packed more densely over here, and be a little skewed, broader in the middle, and then again, they'll be skewed the other way, back more densely. And this is the assumption of possible variability, mean rates, independent variability across the neurons, the optimal way to encode such a stimulus in the sense that given finite encoding resources, certain number of neurons, certain maximum rate, and so forth, you get the most information that if you now consider the distribution of basically the likelihood, actually they use the posterior. If you considered the neuronal activity in response to a stimulus generated by such a population code, and you work out the corresponding posterior overstimuli given that pattern of firing, okay, those posteriors will have a systematically structured bias. The means of those. So you also assume that you respond with the mean, in this case, the circular mean of that distribution. Then you'll get a particular pattern of bias. And that pattern of bias actually quite remarkably well agrees remarkably well with the experimental bias that we've seen in, so far. And this is actually a simulation that attempts to fit the model as fit our histogram using this Weyenstocker, well, Simoncelli, Ganguly and Simoncelli, Weyenstocker, Taylor and Bayes version of the of this encoding scheme as best as we can. Right, so we sort of do the parameter search for that model. And so, yeah, the bias pattern is good. It's you have to get the degree of variability that you actually see. You end up having to assume really very low firing rates or very small numbers of neurons. It doesn't feel right in some sense, given the spike counts. You might be able to compensate for that a little bit with correlated noise, but then the whole argument breaks down once you put in correlated noise. So you have to think about how to recast the experiment. Recast the analysis. In practice, I mean, there's an older psychological model for working memory, variants of things called slots and averaging or limited resource encoding, which has a somewhat similar flavor, but it's a much phenomenological psychophysical model. It's not making any statements about neural encoding. And maybe that's a better way to think about what's going on, is that those kind of psychophysical models, again, apply their resources. So slots and averaging is, you've got a bunch of slots, like these tuning curves, in which you can place a certain number of tokens, and you remember those tokens in the slots, and then you average them together to give the response. So it's very much the same idea. Slots are like cells, tokens are like spikes, and you average them together to give your response. But now it makes sense to say, oh, I've only got 5 tokens, right? Whereas it makes relatively little sense to say I've got 5 spikes to encode this thing, particularly when I'm remembering it over large amounts of time.
Also, another possible thing is that, strictly speaking, their framework is in the limit of n going to infinity, because you want translation and invariance. So their optimization. So then what you get, n should be small.
The problem is that if you actually take n to infinity, then all your tuning curves are infinitely sharp as well. So it's a compromise. It's a weird compromise.
I mean, their optimization is done under constraints that are not very reasonable in the first place. One of them is this large n limit.
But anyway, the thing that I want to point out about this is, while it gets the mean right, the sort of total pattern of distribution is not quite right. In particular, the behavior, I don't have the 2 pictures to show you side by side, but I guess maybe focus on this one. Completely missing is this asymmetry that the data. Okay, so again, there's something that needs to be added on top of this kind of picture in order to account for it, which isn't to say that the underlying notion, whether you think of it as slots and averaging or whether you think about it as efficient coding, I think is we don't necessarily. So actually, let me come back to a point there. So this idea that the natural space to encode in is the one where the background distribution is uniform is a very natural, appealing idea. You can approach it through efficient coding. You can also approach it by saying, well, there's no fundamental reason for the brain, which is finding internal variables to model the world, to actually choose a variable that is has units of angle, right? As long as it carries the information, any axis is fair game, and a natural axis is one that gets used equally often and that applies its resources for encoding reasonably often. So even if you don't think about it as efficient coding and neuronal activity, just think about it as a cognitive model. It's a very natural cognitive model. And so, I think that account for what's going on makes some sense. I should actually add one other thing, which is, unlike in the applications of this model, I should have said this earlier, this is based on means of likelihoods. If we use means of posteriors, which is what, in fact, Weyenstocker did and what Taylor and Bayes did to model the means, this pattern is completely wrong. So you have to go back to likelihoods alone. Or you assume that the observers managed to learn the in-experiment flat prior, but then we wouldn't know why they didn't learn a non-flat prior in the experiment. So there's still some tension with the kind of state of the art in terms of earlier work on working memory.
Maneesh?
Yeah.
so two things.
Yeah.
In their work, they try different, as you know, they try different optimizing functions, and the different functions, which are all reasonable, like mutual information, fish information, so on, will give different scalings with the prior. So that's, there's no reason that the ones they fitted to their cat data should be the same that should be decided here. So that's one thing. The other thing is that their result depends critically on the fact that Poisson noise. So those two things can be modified, and maybe one model in that bigger class of model would give you something close to
it's possible. So I think that, so let me also add, so because these are symmetric, and in a circular case, von Mises distributions, or in a linear case, Gaussian distributions, in this uniformized space, turns out that the maths works out such that the number of associated sufficient statistics is exactly 2. And that is the average of the preferred tuning case, tuning curve location weighted by number of spikes. That's one sufficient statistic. And the other is the total number of spikes, which gives you a precision. The higher the number of spikes, the tighter the distribution. So these are basically all 2-dimensional sufficient statistic models. Again, I think that it's going to be extremely difficult to get this weird categorical-like feature out of that. So I think there is something else going on in orientations. Brains, we'll find that one out once we bring people into lab. I think it's also possible that vertical and horizontal are just more special than other axes are in other dimensions. The other thing is, so in terms of the weighting of the prior, that's a free parameter in this fit, and indeed in most of the other fits. So it's not that we're just taking, say, the Gershik et al. Prior, as you know, the paper by Gershik, Landy, and Simoncelli and Landy was the one that where they went out and measured the distribution of angles and showed that that agreed with 2 alternative force choice experiments. And so that we didn't just use that prior per se, free parameter to use here, and this is our best fit. So I don't think it's about prior scaling. It's certainly, different noise models, as I said, correlation could take a large part, could play a role in terms of the fact that these models are basically too good, right? We need to dilute down the number of spikes very severely in order to be able to account for the amount of variance that you see. It could also be that some combination of this and some kind of Markov encoding will help, right? So that I don't just have one pattern, I have a pattern conditioned on which I get another one, which has added noise. But again, pure Markov encoding won't work for the reasons that we've seen earlier in terms of the fusion process. There has to be something else shaping the Markov process as a function of stimulus. Anyway, so that's where we are. As I said, it's sort of unfinished. It's only yes.
The computation of the likelihood was the empirical computation was done by on the population was done. I mean, I guess
these are averaged over all observers.
Yeah.
We did it both ways. So what I've shown you was always doing collapsed over observers, but the same result holds if we do it observer by observer when we have enough data per observer.
How many trials do you have?
I'm going to have to ask Peter. I don't remember.
Try that you can do it.
We have to bid more closely, but yeah, we can get.
So you're showing a simple sensory slide and asking about memories. So wouldn't this require that the signal travels from one brain area to the other, for example, from sensory to, I don't know, frontal or so and back, and could involve some noisy process?
Yeah, so definitely the noise we're talking about here is some combination of sensory encoding noise and working memory associated noise. And the working memory noise is a large part. We emphasized it, right? So we put up 2 stimuli specifically to increase that component of the noise. And I'm not distinguishing between them, right? So the problem, I mean, in this particular experimental design, if you do it without the memory component. So I just have that up there and say, adjust this one until they match. The variability is too small to be able to make any of these sorts of distinctions. If you make this first one noisier in some other way, so the one case we've done is to, again, take multiple Gabor patches with randomness in their orientations and ask the observer to match the average, then the mean result actually holds, the mean of likelihood result holds, but the pattern of variability changes profoundly. So that's a different kind of noise in that case. And it's a weird sort of noise, right? It's not sensory noise per se. You can see each Gabor just perfectly well. It's some kind of internal computational noise associated with taking an average. Slightly weird thing. We haven't played extensively with contrast. It's a slightly, people often think of contrast as also change, and it does change variability in responses. So it probably changes uncertainty. But that's another axis that we could to explore. Or pixel noise in the background of the stimulus. I mean, there's various things that we will get onto, I think. I think there was a question here before you come back in. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to know what you think about this, them having this assumption of symmetric likelihoods in neural space.
They didn't, so Wage-Stocker do not have it in neural space. So they have it in this, well, I guess it depends a bit on what you mean by neural space. In the uniformized space, things are uniform, but that makes sense because there's no bias one way or the other. When you go back here, they're not. They allow the tuning curves to be skewed. And that's important actually to reproduce these data. If you just shift the means, but you don't allow skewed likelihoods, you can't get it. So that's skewed tuning functions, not skewed likelihood.
The middle one would not be neural space then.
I don't know what you mean by neural space, right? So these are, the neural space is the firing rate of the neurons. This is a mapping, we're looking at the mapping between the external variable and that fire rate. And one way to think about that mapping is to map to a space in which the prior overstimuli is uniform, and then have symmetric response properties or homogeneous response properties. But I can, that's my construction. I could have just given you these tuning curves and made arguments on that basis alone.
I apologize for going back to this point of individual subjects. And
no. It's a good. It's always a good thing.
You said it works in both ways.
Works both ways. I'm not sure.
I mean, you can do analysis on individual subject.
We can. I mean, it's noisier on individual subjects, which is why I'm not trying to show you the subject. But the preference for mean over median and mode, I actually didn't show you the statistics here other than the error bars. But we can do a permutation test to see which one is better, and that remains true across subject by subject.
So the theoretical question, let's suppose that the model is perfect for the individual participants. You have a lot of noise. I mean, you have a lot of variability.
Why should it still be good?
Noise. Do you expect it to work when you do the analysis at the population level?
So it would be trivial that it works on a linear axis. The fact that it works on a circular axis, slightly weird because it has to do with this fact that the law of iterated expectations does not apply on circles. But again, it's pretty close when the amount of variability between those means is relatively small, right? So if everybody is actually responding with the mean, their likelihood, and those distributions are close enough, then yes, it should average out. But again, it would be trivial if it was linear because I would just be averaging together different distributions, and the average of the averages would be the average of the total distribution. It's just that breaks on circles. Okay.
I guess regarding this experiment that you've been describing, I don't know if this is relevant, but is there, I guess, a possibility, and maybe would you need to account for the fact that maybe people are just sort of, I guess, maybe like hardwired to recognize certain angles more than others, so like 0 degrees or 90 degrees or 45 degrees, and so they're sort of more biased to like pick those.
Well, I mean, remember, on average, it's a bias against them, but the precision is much higher when you're close to them. I mean, I think the sort of categorical view that I've been hinting at based on this is a lot like that. There is something special about these vertical and horizontal directions that is reflected not just in a sharper encoding, which is consistent with the efficient coding views and has been known actually for a long time. Just noticeable differences between orientations are also much finer near vertical and horizontal than they are at skewed angles. Right, so there are many such properties out there, which could be ascribed to a prior distribution in nature, or could be ascribed to some internal cost function about it being very important for for posture control, for example, to have vertical and horizontal well represented. So there's various reasons why you might have such a thing. I think what we would be suggesting here is, that plays out again into the way that people make their titrated responses. So we haven't focused so much on why there is this bias, rather that given that there is such a bias and asymmetry, how do people respond? So again, I guess just to sum up, because I think we're out of time. I think that the messages from the context of the course and the kind of development, at least in my lectures, including tomorrow, is that I'd like you to take away from this. First of all, that actually method of adjustment is incredibly powerful. It's not used very much in psychophysics because you have to collect a lot of data to actually fill out a histogram like this. And that's what, online experiments have a lot of disadvantages. One of their advantages is that you can certainly collect a lot of subjects. And when you pull over subjects, you can get quite rich and dense histograms and get those error bars down. And it, when you look at them carefully, they allow us to get access into these sort of internal processes, like the histograms between internal variable and stimulus that I showed you, that are really very powerful. Right? That's a view that we're getting access to under with some assumptions without ever recording in the brain, right? Which is quite effective. So that's one thing. The second thing is this idea that people's behavior is in some sense probabilistically well tuned or well calibrated with variability and uncertainty. We saw it before in terms of combining with other pieces of information. We see it here in something sort of closer to a natural perception plus the working memory is important. Perception plus recall task, where we're basically just saying to the subject, tell us what you saw. And that calibration seems to be very well aligned. And then the third thing is that this experiment and many of the other experiments that I showed you last time that other people have discussed here and that you will have read about and will read about in the future depend on or reveal in some sort of intrinsic variability in people's responses and internal variables conditioned on constant physical external properties. And we really don't know why. Okay, so where that comes from. And I think that's one of the abiding challenges for the field is to really characterize what's going on in terms of that kind of internal variability in sensory pathways. And in particular, one of the messages from here is at least the most parsimonious explanation. I don't think we can, it's hard to say we can rule out anything from here. So we're depending a lot on parsimony, but the most parsimonious explanation for these sorts of data is that most of that is happening on the sensory and memory side, not on the decision and response side, which seems to be well tuned to it. All right, that's me. Were there any other questions online from Beijing?
Beijing students, I think if you have questions, maybe if you can directly ask. Okay, if there are no more questions, so we're going to go for lunch, and the schedule from today's onwards is a little different, so we will be back by 12:30. That is 6:30 in Beijing, 12:30 here. So our second lecture is going to start at 12.